Good evening, everyone, and thank you so much for joining the Centre of FinTech seminar series happening today between 6 and 7. And today we are very delighted to have Tim Aron with us, who is going to be talking about decentralized finance. So he's going to be, the title of his talk today is Demystifying Decentralized Finance, Prospects and Challenges. And just a bit about Tim. So Tim is a lawyer specializing in financial services law and a member of the Specialist Banking and Financial Services Service set in the Minerva Chambers. He's widely regarded as a leading expert in market regulation with a deep practical understanding of securities, derivatives, and various spot markets, including FX and crypto. Tim has acted for some of the highest profile blockchain projects, primarily in an advisory capacity. Advisory work has covered stablecoins, spot markets, securities, derivatives, special CFDs, that's contracts for differences, a variety of regulatory perimeter issues, and numerous anti-money laundering matters. Tim has also been instructed in regards to contractual disputes relating to simple agreements for future tokens and in claims for and against exchanges, cryptocurrency exchanges. Tim has a particular interest in DeFi, and hence he's taking this seminar today. And so we're delighted to have you, Tim. Thank you so much for doing this, and we're all excited to listen to what you have to say. Just a few housekeeping points. If you have any questions whilst Tim is giving his talk and presentation, if you kindly put your questions in the chat, and we would give an extra 10 to 15 minutes towards the end to take the questions. So over to you, Tim, and thank you so much for doing this.
Okay, thank you very much. And thank you very much for the opportunity to present today. The topic I'm covering is decentralized finance. I think the easiest way to think about decentralized finance is, in a sense, to contrast it with the existing financial services system that we have, which you might call centralized finance. In this talk, I often refer to it as the legacy financial services sector as well. But all existing financial institutions that you guys will be in contact contact with would be regarded as a centralized financial services system. So they'll have a central board. They will keep their records centrally. They will usually, even though it's not quite the case, but usually keep funds centrally. And they'll have a head office where they're based, and the head office will be the entity that runs the centralized financial services bank or broker or whichever type of financial institution you're dealing with, and they will be centralized. Decentralized finance is, in a sense, a step away from that. I'll move into sort of some examples of what decentralized finance is, but I just make a note to say that, in a sense, there's nothing necessarily wrong with the current setup. I don't think people are moving towards decentralized finance necessarily because it's entirely problematic. So, for example, when Russia invaded Ukraine, many commentators were, in a sense, pleased that the SWIFT financial system, the interbank telecommunications system known as SWIFT, was in a sense centralized. It could be the members of SWIFT could act to remove certain Russian banks from that fundamental financial system. So in a sense, a centralized financial system has advantages. And the move towards decentralized financial system does pick up on certain disadvantages that have been identified with the existing financial sector. So those disadvantages may well be that there's a point of failure. If a bank collapses, then it collapses and all of its funds are in a centralized place. And in a sense, when you move towards decentralized finance, you have a disbursement of those funds. And I'll get onto some of the details around that. But it's also seen as one of the disadvantages of having a centralized financial system, in the sense that you've got a central control over the money. I'll move on to talk about Bitcoin in a bit more detail, but one of the fundamental factors of a decentralized financial system is often there's no single issuer of the money, so or the token or the coin. So with, for example, Bitcoin, there's no single entity that issues the Bitcoin in the same way a central bank issues money. So it's a move away from central control to, in a sense, a more democratized financial system. So it doesn't necessarily mean that the legacy system has only got problems. There are advantages to having central control, for example, with the actions that were taken as regards SWIFT, but there are also disadvantages, because often the centralized control means that certain actors are kept out of the system, and that brings about concerns which might push people towards thinking about how can we move into a new way of having finance which isn't centralized but decentralized. The idea of decentralized finance, though, has a very pure concept, and at its core is the operation of smart contracts. Smart contracts are basically programs stored on a blockchain that run when predetermined conditions are met. So an example might be if you have a smart contract that says when you have a particular amount of funds in your account, in your wallet or your account, and you want to make a transfer, the transfer will be allowed provided you have those funds in your account, and otherwise it would be blocked. It's very, very simple smart contract idea there, but it would be this kind of concept of a smart contract allows what I would regard as the purest form of decentralized finance, which would be a decentralized exchange. So you have basically smart contracts on the blockchain, which you can interact with by making your funds available, and you can trade to buy cryptocurrencies without any centralized exchange or any centralized bank having any control whatsoever over how you make those transfers or those purchases. It's simply done through a smart contract on the blockchain. That to me is a purest, and probably when people talk about decentralized finance in many contexts, they would regard that kind of pure operation of a smart contract as proper decentralized finance. However, it's a fairly limited use, because the reality is that in order to make a proper developed financial system, it's probably not too controversial to say that you need to have some degree of centralized control over certain aspects of it. So in order to build out an operating custodian or exchange or some form of financial services institution, you'll need to have a central team. You'll need to have somebody who tells the developers what to do. You'll probably need to have a board that makes certain decisions. And in a sense, the moment you start putting those quote unquote legacy type structures in place, you end up with something of a hybrid, and I call it sort of semi-decentralized finance in the note you've got. So you've got certain aspects of it which might be decentralized, but you've also got aspects of it which look and smell like the legacy financial services system. An example of this might be a hybrid decentralized exchange. So many aspects of the exchange will have been built out. There will have been decisions made about the products that the exchange makes available for trading. There will be decisions perhaps about whether or not people who interact with the exchange are subject to anti-money laundering checks. And that exchange, all of those decisions in a sense are made centrally. So in a sense, there is a centralized, something that looks like centralized finance going on, but then certain aspects of decentralized finance will start to play into it. So for example, on those kind of hybrid exchanges, often the funds won't be held centrally, but members of the exchange will have the funds in their own wallet, and they can access the exchange and trade on the exchange without giving control of their funds to a centralized exchange. So you've got this kind of move away from the pure decentralized exchanges, which simply operate as a smart contract and will operate as a smart contract ad infinitum, because they're simply sitting on the blockchain, and nobody, once they've been set up, nobody can interfere with how they operate. If you put a certain amount of money in and somebody else puts some money on the other side, the trade will happen. To these kind of semi-decentralized financial services type institutions, where you have certain aspects which are centralized in terms of decision making and control, but certain aspects which are decentralized in the sense that they bring in many of the technological advantages of decentralized finance, such as not necessarily having to transfer your funds into the central control. That gives rise to the third bullet, or C1C of the defining DeFi section of my slides, where I talk about particular products. So often when you've got decentralized finance taking place, you've got you probably don't necessarily have the pure smart contract existing, but you've got certain aspects of the project which would be regarded as decentralized financial products. An example of this might well be probably the most famous cryptocurrency of all, Bitcoin, in the sense that it's a financial product, but it's in many ways decentralized. You don't have a single issue. There's no issuer of Bitcoin in the same way that there is an issuer of a currency, or sterling, which would be the central bank. Bitcoin isn't issued by anybody. It's mined. I won't go into all of that now, but it's created by basically solving mathematical problems. And so in that sense, as long as you have a powerful enough computer, anybody can create Bitcoin. So it's not under centralized control. So the moment you've got an exchange, which might in all aspects look like a centralized legacy exchange, but if it's trading Bitcoin, it's in this kind of hybrid world. Another example I put in the slide is stablecoins. Stablecoins are really interesting in the sense that they tend to be, they are cryptocurrencies which are backed usually by an existing currency. Now, there have been, some fairly disastrous attempts to do other types of stable coins, algorithmic stable coins, for example. But broadly, a stable coin would be if you pay a central issuer of $1, you will get a $1 equivalent cryptocurrency, which you can trade on one of these decentralized or semi-centralized exchanges. So in a sense, the products trading on these platforms often have decentralized elements. So that dollar you've spent and bought yourself an equivalent cryptocurrency for $1 means that you can then use that dollar electronically, digitally, on any crypto platform anywhere. So that's in a sense a decentralized product operating on an exchange or a decentralized exchange. The other aspect, which I think is just worth noting at the outset around this whole concept of decentralized finance, goes back to an important distinction away from centralized finance, where you'll have a bank which will have all of its records held centrally. Now, they might, in the sense of business continuity, have a number of different places where those records are kept, but they are all basically held centrally at the bank. One of the major components of decentralized finance or cryptocurrencies in general is that you are using blockchain technology. So you've got, in a sense, a decentralized ledger where records are not held centrally, but they're basically held on thousands of computers or everywhere and nowhere, which in a sense means that you can never lose the records or never have the records doctored or changed, because they are sitting on the blockchain. And that's a fundamental aspect of decentralization. That's a fairly convoluted sort of introduction to decentralized finance, but those sort of aspects of it are fairly fundamental to the wider talk I'll be moving into, and I might come back to some of those ideas as I move through the rest of the slide. I think the first question that comes out of consideration of what decentralized finance is a question around what it actually means for legacy financial services, and whether and I put down on the slide, why is decentralized finance regarded as disruptive? I think it is a disruptive technology, and I think the way to best get that across is by thinking about what legacy financial services is, and it comes back to that idea of it being properly centralized. If you want to set up a bank or any financial services institution in the legacy sense, it's incredibly costly in terms of finances and time to actually build the infrastructure to set up a centralized legacy financial services institution. You'll need the capital, you'll need to have the centralized staff, you'll need to have regulatory approvals, and all of that is a real barrier to entry that exists in the legacy financial services system. If you contrast that with what it would take to set up, for example, a decentralized exchange, which is simply going to be code on a blockchain that anybody with a wallet can interact with, you can actually see why having this, you can actually see why if you had the choice of either setting up a legacy exchange, which probably would take you 2 or 3 years to get the regulatory approvals, let alone building out all of the technology around it, with actually being able to simply put a smart contract on the blockchain that will allow people to carry out exchange activities between themselves, you can see almost immediately how the decentralized finance is actually an incredibly easy tool to disrupt in terms of the cost of entry. The other aspect that I think is quite important when thinking about why it's disruptive is, in many ways, the technology removes the need for intermediaries. So in the legacy sector has come about probably over the last 30, 40, 50 years. All of these brokers, banks, insurers, etc., have between them developed a web of contractual arrangements, have developed a web of licenses which allow them to do certain things, and also sort of a web of services that they provide to each other. If you think, for example, about a legacy exchange, CME or London Stock Exchange, what you've got built around the exchange, you've got the exchange itself, you've got members of the exchange. To make the exchange operate, you've probably got settlement banks that operate with the exchange. You've probably got a web of brokers which have to interact with the exchange, prime brokers and interdealer brokers, and probably a huge amount of other service providers which bring particular products to market, the sponsors, and all of this, in a sense, makes the legacy financial services sector complicated and expensive, and in a sense, a very closed club. If you contrast that with a crypto exchange, now this doesn't have to be a pure DEX, a pure exchange on a smart contract. It could be one of those sort of hybrid type exchanges where you've got a centralized team, but using many of the crypto products. You could actually allow a person sitting in South America to exchange safely, securely, and in real time, immediately, value with somebody sitting in Europe. And you can do that incredibly cheaply to build out that exchange, and without the need for that whole web of supporting actors. You don't have to have all of those intermediary banks, those brokers, those prime brokers, those members. You simply need to have one person who can connect their account or their wallet in South America with the person who can connect their wallet in Europe to the exchange, and they can trade immediately. So it's disruptive in the sense it removes all of those intermediaries from the system. And the moment you start to do that, it's threatening, because many of those brokers or those intermediaries exist because they've always existed, or largely always existed. They've got all the licenses. They've spent years negotiating the contracts and building up the relationships with their various clients. And suddenly this technology allows anybody with a computer and fairly advanced knowledge, I suppose, but at the same time a computer, to offer the same service in terms of value transfer with technology which is probably more advanced and more immediate in terms of how it acts, at a pure fraction of the cost of creating an exchange. So in that sense, it's extremely disruptive, because you suddenly, for almost no cost, can provide similar services. I'm not going to say exactly the same, obviously, for reasons I'll probably get onto, but very similar services to the services provided by the legacy financial services system. And I put down as 1C of this section accessibility, but I think I've covered that off in the sense that it becomes accessible provided you've got a computer and the capability to create one of these exchanges without necessarily having all of the licenses and interconnections that a legacy exchange would have. The other reason it's disruptive is because it doesn't really conform with any of the concepts or approaches that exist in regards to how the legacy sector is regulated. So one thing that is worth bearing in mind is that often the products that we're talking about, so the one I talked about first is Bitcoin, but many of these cryptocurrencies or these stable coins, they don't fall into a bracket of what we in the UK would call a specified investment. They're not a financial product. They don't fall into the definition of a financial product. So immediately, when you're dealing with these new kinds of concepts such as Bitcoin, you're not even necessarily dealing in money as defined either. So you've got these new concepts, and legislation and law, the basis under which all regulators act, hasn't caught up with many of these concepts. Now, I put down on the slide, not financial products unless you're the SEC. The SEC in the States have, I think, fairly famously taken the approach of enforcing against many of these products, and doing so on the basis that they have put out guidance which has interpreted legislation so broadly that it would capture them. The approach in the EU and the UK hasn't been to do that. So, for example, we would never say in the UK that Bitcoin is a financial product or a specified investment, which means that the way the regulations work in the UK is regulators, or the FCA in particular, can only really bite if you're doing an activity which relates to a specified investment, a security, or a derivative or the like. And if you're not doing something which relates to a specified investment, then it doesn't fall within their regulatory perimeter. The other connected to that reason why it's disruptive is regulators work on the basis of regulating by place of establishment. So in the UK, you fall within the UK's, the FCA's regulated perimeter if you're carrying on a regulated activity by way of business in the UK. So the regulated activity, to stick with the example of exchanges, might be arranging deals and investments. And if you're arranging deals and investments, that would be for example, a security or a financial product. If you do it by way of business, and the important part for this point is that it's done in the UK. So if you have an exchange which is a legal entity set up, for example, as a company in the UK, and you're carrying on the activity of arranging or operating a regulated investment exchange, or dealing as agent, or dealing as principal, or whatever the actual activity might be, you are caught because you're doing that activity in regards to a specified investment, a security, or a derivative, and you're doing it in the UK. And what crypto or decentralized finance does is it allows anybody to sit outside the UK and offer these same services into the UK, but not have a place of business in the UK, so therefore not be caught by UK regulators. So a typical model for entities which are operating in the DeFi space would be to set up a company in somewhere like the BVI or the Seychelles, and then to offer their exchange services from that company outside the UK. Now, the way regulation works is that I can sit in London and choose to trade on an exchange in Saudi Arabia, Singapore, Malaysia. And that's my choice. And it's very unlikely a regulator in London would say, or an institution in London would say, you haven't got the choice to trade that Saudi Arabian exchange, Singaporean exchange, etc. In exactly the same way, somebody sitting in Singapore could choose to access a UK exchange. And it's because you've got this decentralized idea of offerings, anybody in the UK could basically go onto the internet and access an exchange anywhere in the world. And what you've actually created is a challenge to the need to be established somewhere in the world in order to offer your services. Now, it gets a little bit more tricky with marketing, because what usually happens is regulators say, fine, you can access, we can't stop you accessing an exchange in the BVI. We can't stop you accessing an exchange in Seychelles, but we can stop that exchange marketing into the UK, or carrying out a financial promotion which has an effect in the UK. Now, that in itself works if you're talking about legacy financial services products, securities, derivatives, because the financial promotion rules, the marketing rules, prevent somebody from marketing financial products unless certain things are done. Now, obviously, as I mentioned, many of these products don't fall into the definition of financial products. So in that sense, the financial promotion rules in the UK don't, in a sense, protect the public from these things. But often they are marketed in new ways. So what you often have is crypto projects marketing not so much the products that are listed on the exchange, but the concept of the exchange, and they do it through Instagram and the like, or Telegram, and it sort of spreads by word of mouth. So the tools for the regulators are not really equipped to either stop the accessing of the decentralized platforms or even the marketing of the decentralized platforms, which in a sense makes them potentially disruptive both to the regulatory system, but also to the legacy financial services system that exists. This sort of moves me on to the next section of my slide, which is about what regulators should do and how regulators should, in a sense, respond to the challenges that are thrown up by this new technology. The reality is regulators, at least in the UK, did very little for a very long time. You might even say haven't done anything yet to properly start regulating cryptocurrencies. The approach they've taken so far has been clamping down on anti-money laundering for crypto projects, which only works so far because it will only apply to the extent those projects are set up in the UK or managed from an office in the UK. If the projects are pure DeFi, as in the type I talked about at the very beginning, where they're sitting on a smart contract and they haven't got any form of centralized control, then they won't have any way to put in place anti-money laundering protections, which means that you can use these pure decentralized financial exchanges to exchange products and not have to carry out any KYC. Likewise, many of these projects are set up in jurisdictions and accessible from the UK or other jurisdictions, and those jurisdictions haven't put in place equivalent anti-money laundering protections as the UK. So that's a bit piecemeal in terms of how the UK has approached regulation, because they might have put in place fairly high standards in the UK, but it doesn't mean that they can impose those standards everywhere in the world. The other way they've talked about regulating decentralized finance is by putting in place marketing restrictions, which pretty much bring the same standards in terms of marketing to cryptocurrencies as apply to legacy financial products such as securities and derivatives. And that again probably works only to a degree. The financial promotion restrictions, as I mentioned, apply to promotions which have an effect in the UK. So if you're marketing a particular cryptocurrency exchange or a particular cryptocurrency, and it can be seen by somebody in the UK, the regulator could theoretically take action against the marketer, the promoter, but the reality is actually taking action against, I don't know, a 19-year-old sitting somewhere in South America churning out these promotions isn't very likely that the regulator would be able to do that. It's very different from the world where the financial promotion regime was set up to stop existing or UK-based entities from pushing products too hard. It's a very new world, so I don't think the regulations really properly restrict marketing in the way the FCA hopes they will do, which has led to various discussions about how regulators should go about regulating or putting restrictions in place which actually are effective in terms of regulating crypto projects or decentralized finance projects. Some have talked about moving away from the idea of regulating on the basis of a place of establishment. Exactly how that would work hasn't really been panned out, but most of those approaches tend to be along lines of discussing whether there's the possibility of achieving or agreeing on some kind of international standards as regards crypto. And to an extent that has worked as regards AML. The FATF standards have pretty much imposed standards across the board in many jurisdictions, which are of the same standard. But the trouble is, with all of these, is that you only need one or two safe spaces for very pure decentralized projects to operate from, and they haven't necessarily opted into those jurisdictions, won't necessarily have opted into the international standards. And because it's accessible, anybody in the world could access those projects, and they could be doing it without, from a tax haven, so they haven't got the same burdens in terms of tax imposed on them. They could be pushing their products extremely aggressively without the marketing restrictions, and they can do that relatively safely, provided they found jurisdictions from which they can operate. So it is very difficult to think that the likelihood of having proper international agreed standards in terms of how to regulate crypto in any time soon, I think is pretty unlikely. And actually, I think the other reason why it's unlikely is that there's probably about 4 or 5 significant financial centres in the world: Frankfurt, London, New York, Hong Kong, Singapore, maybe a few more. And they have a stranglehold on financial services, legacy financial services. There's probably about 10 or 20 budding financial centres who realistically know they'll never be the next London, they'll never be the next Frankfurt, but they think, and probably quite correctly, if they use crypto for all of the, or decentralized finance to a degree, for all of the reasons I've talked about in terms of how disruptive it is, they could actually start having entities regulated in those jurisdictions which could potentially be disruptive to the existing financial centres. So these jurisdictions would be loath to adopt standards or international standards which in a sense allow not so much the legacy financial system but the legacy financial sectors, London, Frankfurt, New York, etc., to continue with the dominance. They want to find a way to be disruptive and to allow their own financial services sectors to develop. So they will be fairly hesitant to sign up to international regulatory approaches if that means crypto gets, or these disruptive aspects of decentralized finance get strangled at birth before they have a chance to potentially be disruptive to the legacy financial sectors. I'm going to say I'm sort of conscious of time. I've got about 10 minutes left. I'm going to say something very briefly about the legacy sector and how they regard crypto. I think I have a friend who is a very senior banker, and he said to me that they've looked at crypto for a long time and they are very supportive of it in terms of some of those aspects I talked about, the extent to which it allows the technology is in a sense so cheap to roll out, and is in many ways so much more advanced than often 10, 20-year-old systems sitting in legacy banks which haven't been updated, which crumble, which have all kinds of problems in terms of settlement, etc., etc. So they're very taken by the capabilities of decentralized finance in terms of technology. But what they realized is the moment they start to roll it out, they will lose all of their competitive advantage, which comes from the licenses they have and the interconnections they have with the wider financial system. Because, as I mentioned, all of those interconnections are no longer needed. So there's a huge amount of vested interest internally against rolling out this technology, because those guys won't necessarily get their bonuses this year, because they exist on the basis of those interconnections that I talked about. So the approach of the legacy sector, I think, has always been to talk up the risks of crypto. And I'm not saying the risks don't exist, but the risks and the downsides of crypto. So, for example, the extent to which it can be used for money laundering or tax evasion, etc. So I think the legacy sector have adopted an approach which has really been to basically say nothing to be seen here, focus on the services we provide, and anything going on in the crypto space is probably a bit dodgy. I think that probably stopped maybe 2 or 3 years ago. And there's been a move from the legacy sector to start trying to adopt the technology internally and to roll it out to their clients in a safer way as possible, without totally disrupting the wider bread and butter for the business. That only really works so far, because ultimately the better technology will always rise to the surface. And I think the legacy sector probably are now, particularly given some of the fairly fundamental failures in crypto in the last year, think that the best way for them to operate is, in a sense, to coexist. They're never going to necessarily quash crypto altogether, but they will draw a very clear distinction between what they provide as services, which are regulated, highly trusted, trustworthy, with the existence of these decentralized products out there, or decentralized projects out there, which don't have the same pedigree, which don't have the same degree of safety for consumers. And in a sense, anyone who opts into that world does so at their own risk. But at the same time, if they want a safe world, if they want a known world, then they should stick with the legacy financial services system. So I sort of see a little bit of a distinction in terms of service and safety being drawn, rather than full-scale adoption, at least at the moment. I'm conscious that there probably will be some questions, so I'll skim through the future of DeFi section, which is my last section, fairly quickly. I think that anyone who looks at decentralized finance, in particular technology, will realize that it is it's probably not the best word, but a better technology. So I'm working at the moment with a client building out a tokenized securities exchange, and it's so much cheaper to operate, so much cheaper for the members or anyone who wants to list on the exchange to do so, so much more accessible to people who want to trade on the exchange, that the technology is just so obviously better, so obviously faster, so obviously more secure, that when you contrast that with the legacy sector and the amount of different interconnections they have, and all of those interconnections could theoretically fail, I think you can always say that that technology will, in a sense, prevail. But what DeFi doesn't have, and I don't really see it as having a huge prospect of having it in the near future, is all of the years of regulatory protections that have been built around the legacy sector. So if you buy a DeFi product, you haven't got a prospectus, you haven't got a disclosures made to you, you haven't got somebody, if you go into a bank and you take out money and you have one of those pieces of paper read to you about all of the risks that you might have if you walk around with cash. None of that exists in this space. None of those protections exist because it's not regulated. No one's telling any of these projects how to behave, what to do in terms of disclosures to their users. And although you might say those protections don't really mean anything because nobody actually listens or reads prospectuses or reads offering documents, the fact is they do exist, and those protections are in a sense supported by wider protections such as the Financial Ombudsman Service, the Financial Services Compensation Scheme. Those are protections which are built around the legacy financial services sector that just don't exist in this space, in the DeFi space. So that in a sense creates problems for DeFi because it's never going to be properly, even though it's accessible in the sense that technology is accessible, it's never going to be accessible to my grandmother because she's just not going to want to take a risk, or she won't actually understand what she's buying without a lot of the built-in protections in the legacy financial services sector. That ties in with issues around some of the recent events, the trust perception of it, and it also ties in with some of the vested interest points I was making earlier about how the legacy sector views crypto. One final point I'll make on this is it's very difficult to actually monetize a pure crypto project. If you put a code on the blockchain and allow that smart contract to operate, it's quite difficult for the people who developed that and put it out in the public domain and let it run to actually make any money out of it, which is the motivating factor for, realistically all financial services projects. So you need to have a kind of mix with CeFi in order to have your to take your slice of the pie. So you need to have a centralized aspect as well as the decentralized components in order to properly monetize a project. And in doing that, you often lose out on some of the pure benefits that exist with decentralized finance. I think I've got 1 minute. I think, in my view, the most likely possible future as regards crypto adoption in the near term would be a a very, very slow adoption in existing financial centres. But I think there'll be an incredibly fast adoption in the developing economies. So a client of mine is Tether, which is the largest stable coin, and it's being very, very widely used in many developing economies because people would rather have US dollar Tether sitting in a wallet than take a risk on their local currencies and the fluctuations. So I think what you'll actually see is very slow adoption, gradual adoption in legacy financial services centres, but a real move in developing economies to adopt many of the aspects of the technology very, very quickly. I'll pause there. Apologies for rushing the ending a bit, but I'm conscious of time, so please do ask questions if you have any.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Tim, for an amazing presentation. Thank you so much for actually trying the time covering such a very complex topic. I can't imagine sort of trying to cover DeFi in less than an hour, and you've given it a good shot, and also giving it a quite balanced perspective. So thank you so much for that. And for the students, I'd like to sort of emphasize, which I didn't do at the start of it. So Tim, of course, is a practicing barrister in the space. And like you heard, he referred to a few of his clients a few times. So you're actually getting the practice dimension of things. But I can see that we've got a hand up. So I think the hand is Peter. Peter, would you like to ask your question?
Thank you so much, Mr. Tim. That was a very enlightening session for me. However, the explanations you made clearly gave more in-depth explanations to the benefits and the interesting part of decentralized financial system or technology, as the case may be. Yes, it's interesting to know that it's taking over and is really disrupting the financial sector of the traditional practice. But I feel it poses a whole lot of threats to the users, to the environment, in fact, to the government too. And for me, regulations create order and security. So I'm worried about how this aspect will be regulated. What form of regulation will really put people's mind or fear to rest? Please, could you enlighten us more on possible regulations that can guide this technological aspect, this decentralized system that is taking over, that will give us that assurance that our resources are safe? Thank you.
And Tim, just before you actually take the question, I see there's a question in the chat that seems to be along the same lines. And I think that's a question by Mark, who actually talks really about, why the technology doesn't actually take over traditional finance, and also really, can decentralized finance be regulated? Can it really be regulated? Obviously, given the challenges of it. So yeah.
Yeah, so I think I'm getting a bit of feedback. Yeah, I think that the way you can regulate it is, I think I mentioned I was working on a tokenized securities exchange. So that is an exchange which lists securities, but they're in tokenized form. So if you're going to list on that exchange, you will need to put out a prospectus in exactly the same way as if you were listing on London Stock Exchange on a legacy exchange. So when you've got a product which is falls into the square brackets of a specified investment or a derivative, then the same standards should apply, and they do apply. The difficulty, I think, comes when you've got products which don't necessarily fall into those brackets and the legislation hasn't caught up. The other complication is that if you have you can really only regulate by giving the investor or the user as much information as they need in order to make their own decisions. And none of those, I think that's where you've got that gap between products which properly fall into the regulated space and the other products, is that the investors don't necessarily have, there's no authority in a sense saying to put those standards or that information out there. And often the information, even if you did put it out there, wouldn't quite deal with the risks that exist in the new types of products. So what I mean by that is the disclosure requirements wouldn't necessarily catch up with the risks, which may well be risks around the possibility of a smart contract getting hacked or something. It just wouldn't be a disclosure obligation there. So I think what you have to do is a twofold approach. One is consider what are the proper disclosure requirements for these new products and actually make sure that they're covered off, so any investor or anyone purchasing them gets the correct disclosures for the products. But also you need to have a way of imposing on the projects those disclosure obligations. Just to give an example, the collapse fairly recently of the stablecoin Terra, UST, it was paying 20% interest rates. Loads of people went in and purchased it, but there was very, very little in the public domain about the risks, and possibly people would have read nothing about it because they saw 20% interest rates and that was all that mattered to them. Or potentially some investors would have actually read the risks and actually realized that there was a possibility the stablecoin could depeg in certain conditions and not have risked their funds. But either way, those two factors weren't there. There was no obligation for those disclosures to be made. And even if there was an obligation for disclosures to be made, it's very unlikely that the disclosures would have covered off the risks in the correct way. So both of these things need to happen. I don't think regulators are going to be there in terms of imposing those standards anytime soon, because the moment the regulator starts to impose the standards, the projects will move to a jurisdiction where they don't have to impose the standards. The only way I think it can happen is if the market starts to demand it. If enough failures happen, FTX type failures or other failures happen, and users or start to say, hang on a second, am I really going to put my funds into this without properly understanding it to a certain degree? And the projects themselves might have to start saying, we're expecting people to put their own funds in. These are new risks. The way we're going to differentiate ourselves from other projects is to actually start disclosing all of the risks and letting people make their minds up on the back of those disclosures.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Tim, for that. I'm very conscious of time. I think we'll take two more questions, but very, very quickly, please. So I think Adnan.
Hey there. Hey, Tim. Lovely presentation. Really enjoyed it. I have two questions realistically. One is about, I personally myself am heavily invested within cryptocurrencies. I'm asking whether or not you yourself are invested, what project specifically you'd be invested in, and your price prediction for cryptocurrencies as a general within the next decade. And then the second question is about employability within decentralized finance.
I'm probably the last person you want to ask about predictions. I don't really invest, not because of any huge objection to investing, but more because I just don't really feel that I have enough information to be making sensible decisions. And it comes back to, I suppose, my answer to the first, the previous question. Quite often I get projects don't have any money when they have to pay me, so they pay me in their token. So I do have a whole lot of tokens which are probably worth about 10p at the moment because they're all crashed in value. So I don't even really follow the markets too closely. But I think, having said that, my feeling is, and I mean, I'm not even a significant holder of Bitcoin, but I think that the fact that there's a limited supply of Bitcoin, I think the fact that it is so cross-jurisdictional, and just on the basis of sort of supply-demand economics, I do think it is going to have another incredible surge soon. Whether or not that's sustainable, I doubt, and it will probably spike and fall away. But I think that the market just suggests to me that there will be enough weight behind it to push it back up, probably to 100k, maybe in the next 2 years.
That's what we pray for. Yep.
If you hold it. Yeah.
And this is not financial advice you're receiving from.
Of course not. Just
from me, here.
It's not a specified investment, so I'm okay.
Wisdom, I think, if we hear from you, I think you're on mute. Wisdom.
Okay, thank you so much. I don't really have a question. I just want to contribute a little to what Tim said. Okay, I'm a lawyer by profession, and I've been trading for like close to 5 to 6 years. And in recent times, I've been monitoring the DeFi protocols and coins. But what I want to say is very simple. I'm a strong advocate of regulation, and that is why with my lecturer Clinton, I'm actually trying to write an essay regarding regulation of financial market with regards to cryptocurrency. I strongly believe in regulation. I know how much DeFi want to decentralize the market, but regulation goes deep to everything we do. If you look at what is going on currently with regards to Silvergate, Signature Bank, and with all is going around the crypto market recently, it all boils down to regulation. In as much we want to decentralize the market, we should also find a place of regulation.
Thank you so much for your comment. Basically, you're saying regulation, one of the rationales for it is investor protection. So thank you so much for that. But I've got a very interesting question. This one last question in the chat, which says, does DeFi have decentralized insurance platform for investors like the centralized system?
So it says that question, does DeFi
have a decentralized insurance platform for investors like the centralized system?
I don't know is the answer. I know that there are some. I was approached probably about 2 years ago by some fairly embryonic ideas about how to develop a DeFi insurance platform. I did some very initial advice on it, and I didn't hear anything further from them. But it wouldn't surprise me at all if there are. In fact, I know that there are some decentralized insurance products out there which even operate through some DAOs. So yeah, I think they are out there. I don't know the names of any of them, unfortunately, but I think that it's an area that actually I suspect would be one of the 2 or 3 big developing areas in DeFi over the next few years.
Yeah, so I think it is indeed an area that's developing, and I think there are a couple now actually that are out there as operating as DAOs yeah. Insurance services. Nexus comes to mind, but it's not an area I myself have looked at, but there are a couple of them out there. So yes, you're quite right in that. And I'll just say, maybe take the CBDC question only because CBDCs are quite sort of in vogue now. So it says, can central bank digital currencies be a solution to using the DeFi technology in CeFi and be regulated? So I think it is might this person be referring to CBDCs than stable coins, perhaps?
Yeah, I think for these ones, it comes down to almost a philosophical approach, doesn't it? Because some people think, maybe sort of in line with Wisdom's comments, that the future must be more controlled through regulation, but some people actually balk at the idea of that. So I'm working on one of my clients is Tether, and their philosophy is very much away from the idea of a CBDC. I think they're very public about that, and they're very conscious that if the extent to which, even though they are coming back to that concept, they are a centralized project because they issue Tether. So in that sense, they're centralized. If somebody steals Tether, they can freeze the stolen Tether. So there's all aspects of it which is centralized. Of course, there's decentralized aspects as well, but they're very conscious that their users would trust them as a team rather than, say, a central bank, where if you haven't paid or the central bank or the government thinks you haven't paid your tax the previous year, then potentially they could remove that from your wallet immediately and pay themselves. Or some of them might be a bit apocryphal, but some of the ideas around what a government could do with a stable coin in terms of controlling how you spend, monitoring how you spend, would be very concerning to many users, and they would opt towards a stable coin such as a stable coin rather than a CBDC. So it does come down to what the market wants, I think. And if the market will prefer having that degree of control with the government, which almost flies in the whole face of crypto generally, or would they rather trust a project which doesn't necessarily have the same impetus to act in a particular way like a government? And it comes down to that.
Brilliant. Well, thank you so much. Thank you so much. And on that note, we'd like to say a very big thank you to Tim Aron. We're definitely going to have you back again because, of course, as you can see, we didn't have that much time to go through all the questions. We still have some hands up, and obviously you had to cover it in such a rush. So we're definitely going to be inviting you again, but we really just say thank you so much for your time this evening, for doing this for us, for covering it so clearly and articulately, and just for being with us this evening. And on that note, we'll just say thank you so much for everybody that has attended.